They say every perfect family has its secrets. But some secrets are so dark, so twisted, that when they finally surface, they don't just destroy lives, they obliterate entire bloodlines. Meet the Whitmore family of Beacon Hill, Massachusetts. From the outside, they had everything the American dream promised. Richard Whitmore, 34, was a rising star at Boston's most prestigious investment firm. His wife Sarah, 29, came from old money, the kind that built universities and had wings of hospitals named after them. And then there was Victoria Sterling, Sarah's mother, 48 years old, and the kind of woman who could stop traffic even in her late 40s. Victoria wasn't your typical mother-in-law. While most women her age were settling into comfortable obscurity, she was just hitting her stride. After her husband's death 3 years prior, she'd inherited a fortune that made the Whitmore family wealth look like pocket change. More importantly, she'd inherited something else, a hunger for life that had been suppressed for 25 years of marriage to a man 30 years her senior. The Whitmore mansion sat on Louisburg Square, where cobblestone streets whispered stories of old Boston elite. It was here, during Sarah's pregnancy with their first child, that the family dynamics began to shift in ways no one could have predicted. Richard had always been ambitious, but ambition without substance is just noise. He was the kind of man who looked good in a suit, said the right things at dinner parties, and had mastered the art of appearing successful without actually achieving much. His marriage to Sarah was as much a business merger as a love story. Her family's connections opened doors that his charm alone never could. But Victoria Sterling was different. She saw through Richard's polished exterior from day one. During family dinners, while Sarah gushed about her husband's latest big deal, Victoria would catch Richard's eye across the table. There was something in her gaze, not quite approval, not quite disdain. It was assessment, like a chess master studying her opponent's opening moves. Richard works so hard, Sarah would say, her hand resting on her growing belly. Sometimes I worry he'll burn himself out before the baby comes. Victoria would smile, that knowing smile of hers. Oh, darling, I'm sure Richard knows exactly how to pace himself. Don't you, Richard? The way she said his name with just a hint of something that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair should have been the first warning sign. But Richard was too intoxicated by the family's wealth and status to notice he was being studied like a specimen under a microscope. The pregnancy brought them all closer together. Sarah, dealing with severe morning sickness, often retreated to bed early, leaving Richard and Victoria alone in the sprawling living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the common. These weren't planned encounters, at least, that's what Richard told himself. You know, Victoria said one evening in October, swirling her wine glass as autumn leaves danced outside, I was married to Sarah's father for 25 years. 25 years of pretending to be the perfect corporate wife. Do you know what that does to a woman, Richard? He should have excused himself. Should have mumbled something about checking on Sarah. Instead, he found himself leaning forward, genuinely curious. What does it do? Victoria's laugh was low, almost musical. It teaches you to recognize performance when you see it. And you, my dear son-in-law, are giving quite a performance. The accusation hung in the air between them. Richard felt his throat go dry. I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't. Victoria stood, moving to the window. Even in the dim lamplight, her silhouette was striking, tall, elegant, dangerous. Sarah thinks you're working late at the office. But I know better. I had lunch with Margaret Thornton last week. Her husband is a partner at your firm. Interesting conversation we had. Richard's blood went cold. Margaret Thornton's husband would know exactly how many hours Richard actually worked. How many deals he'd actually closed, how much money he was actually bringing in. Victoria, relax. She turned back to him, and for the first time, he saw not his mother-in-law, but a woman. A beautiful, intelligent, dangerous woman who held his future in her perfectly manicured hands. Your secret is safe with me. For now. That night, as Richard lay next to his sleeping wife, he stared at the ceiling and tried to convince himself that the conversation with Victoria meant nothing. That the way she'd looked at him meant nothing. That the electricity he'd felt when their hands briefly touched as she handed him his coat meant absolutely nothing. But deep down, in a part of his soul he didn't like to acknowledge, Richard knew that everything was about to change. The perfect family facade was already beginning to crack, and Victoria Sterling was the woman holding the hammer. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Victoria had been planning this moment for months. Ever since she'd discovered the truth about her son-in-law's professional failings, she'd been waiting for the right opportunity to use that information. Not to destroy him, but to possess him. Because Victoria Sterling had spent 3 decades being possessed by others, first by her parents, then by her much older husband. Now, finally, she was ready to do some possessing of her own. And Richard Whitmore, with his handsome face and hollow ambitions, was about to learn what it felt like to be owned by a woman who had nothing left to lose. 3 months after Sarah gave birth to little Emma, the Whitmore household had settled into a new rhythm, one that would prove to be as dangerous as it was deceptive. Sarah, exhausted from sleepless nights and struggling with postpartum depression that she refused to acknowledge, had essentially withdrawn from family life. She spent most days in her bedroom with the baby, claiming she needed rest but really hiding from a world that suddenly felt too bright, too demanding, too overwhelming. This left Richard and Victoria alone together more often than ever before. What started as awkward small talk over morning coffee while Sarah slept in gradually evolved into something far more intimate, long conversations that stretched late into the night, shared glances that lasted a beat too long, and a growing awareness that they were playing with fire. Victoria was masterful in her approach. She never crossed the line overtly, never made the first move that could be classified as inappropriate. Instead, she created an atmosphere of intimacy through 1,000 small gestures. A hand on his shoulder as she passed behind his chair at dinner, asking for his opinion on business matters that put them physically close as they reviewed documents. Compliments about his appearance that were just specific enough to seem personal but just vague enough to seem innocent. "That shirt brings out your eyes," she'd say, her own eyes traveling down his body in a way that made it clear she wasn't just looking at his shirt. "Sarah's lucky to have such a handsome husband," she'd add, the implication being that Sarah didn't appreciate what she had. Richard found himself looking forward to these interactions with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified him. He began choosing his clothes with Victoria in mind, staying up later hoping for those moments alone with her, and finding excuses to be in whatever room she occupied. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March. Sarah had gone to bed early with a headache, and Emma was finally sleeping through the night. Richard found Victoria in the study, going through her late husband's papers, something she'd been putting off for 3 years. "It's strange," she said without looking up as he entered. "You live with someone for 25 years, and then you go through their things and realize you never really knew them at all." Richard poured himself a scotch from the bar cart, something he'd started doing regularly during these evening conversations. "What do you mean?" Victoria held up a leather-bound journal. "Harold kept a diary. Every day for 25 years. Do you know what he wrote about me?" She finally looked at Richard, and he was shocked to see tears in her eyes. "Nothing. 25 years of marriage, and I'm mentioned exactly 17 times. 17 times, Richard. Usually in the context of social obligations or household expenses." The vulnerability in her voice was like a physical blow. Without thinking, Richard crossed the room and sat beside her on the leather sofa, closer than he'd ever sat before. "Victoria, I'm sure that's not." "It is." She laughed bitterly. "I was furniture to him. Expensive, well-maintained furniture that looked good at dinner parties and produced the required air. Nothing more." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Richard could smell her perfume, something French and expensive that made his head spin. He could see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she closed the journal. "You're not furniture," he said quietly. Victoria turned to look at him, and suddenly the space between them seemed to evaporate. "Aren't I? Be honest, Richard. When you look at me, what do you see?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. Richard could have deflected, could have made some generic comment about her being a wonderful mother-in-law. Instead, he found himself trapped by her gaze, compelled to tell the truth. "I see a woman who's been wasted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A woman who deserves to be seen, really seen, for who she is." "And who am I?" The question was so soft he almost missed it. Richard's hand moved of its own accord, reaching up to touch her cheek. "You're beautiful. You're intelligent. You're strong. You're..." He paused, knowing that his next words would change everything between them forever. "You're the most captivating woman I've ever met." Victoria's breath caught. For a moment they sat frozen, his hand on her cheek, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Then she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "Richard, I know," he whispered. "I know this is crazy. I know we shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" Her eyes opened, and there was steel in them now. "Shouldn't acknowledge what's been building between us for months? Shouldn't admit that I think about you when I'm alone? Shouldn't confess that I've been orchestrating these moments because I need to feel something other than invisible?" The confession hit Richard like a physical blow. All those seemingly accidental encounters, all those intimate conversations, Victoria had been carefully constructing a web, and he'd walked right into it willingly. "You've been planning this," he said, but there was no accusation in his voice. Only awe. Victoria smiled, the first truly genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I've been hoping for this." "There's a difference." Richard knew he should leave. Should go upstairs to his wife and baby daughter and pretend this conversation never happened. Should maintain the boundaries that society and morality demanded. Instead, he found himself leaning closer, drawn by a gravitational pull he couldn't resist. "Victoria, if we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back." "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "I'm tired of being a ghost in my own life. I'm tired of pretending I don't feel anything. I'm tired of being Harold's widow and Sarah's mother and nothing else. For once in my life, I want to be just Victoria. And I want to be Victoria with you." Their faces were inches apart now. Richard could feel her breath on his lips, could see his own desire reflected in her eyes. "What about Sarah?" he managed to ask. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "Sarah has everything I never had: youth, genuine love from her husband, a beautiful child, a whole life ahead of her. She'll never know what it's like to wake up at 48 and realize you've never truly lived." "I do love her," Richard said, though even as he said it, the words felt hollow. "I know you do," Victoria replied. "The same way Harold loved me. Safely, distantly, without passion or fire or real connection." Her hand moved to cover his, still resting on her cheek. "But this, what's happening between us right now, this is different. This is real." Richard knew she was right. What he felt for Sarah was comfortable, expected, appropriate. What he felt for Victoria was dangerous, unexpected, inappropriate, and more intense than anything he'd ever experienced. "One kiss," Victoria whispered. "Just one. So we both know what this is." Richard's resolve crumbled. He closed the final inches between them, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted like expensive wine and forbidden fruit and the end of innocence. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Now what?" Richard asked. Victoria stood, smoothing down her skirt with shaking hands. "Now we see how long we can pretend that never happened." She walked to the door, pausing to look back at him one last time. "Sweet dreams, Richard." After she left, Richard sat alone in the study, his head in his hands. He'd crossed a line he'd never imagined crossing, with a woman he should have seen as family, while his wife and child slept upstairs. And the most terrifying part of all? He was already planning their next encounter. Victoria Sterling had gotten what she wanted: a crack in Richard's armor. Now all she had to do was widen that crack until his entire world came crashing down. What Richard didn't realize was that Victoria's plan went far beyond seduction. She'd been backed into a corner by years of invisibility and loneliness, and she wasn't going to settle for stolen moments and secret kisses. Victoria Sterling wanted it all. And she was willing to destroy everything to get it. For 3 weeks after the kiss, Richard and Victoria played an elaborate game of pretend. During family dinners, they were perfectly appropriate, polite, distant, the picture of proper in-law relations. But underneath the surface, every glance was charged with electricity, every innocent touch burned with possibility. Sarah, still struggling with her postpartum fog, noticed nothing. She was too busy being overwhelmed by motherhood, too caught up in her own internal battles with inadequacy and exhaustion. When she looked at her husband and mother, she saw what she expected to see: Richard being respectful, Victoria being helpful. She had no idea she was watching a slow-motion seduction unfold in her own home. The breaking point came during the first week of April, during what should have been the most innocent of encounters. Sarah had driven to Providence to visit her college roommate for the weekend, taking baby Emma with her. It was the first time she'd left the house for more than a few hours since giving birth, and everyone agreed she needed the break. Richard had planned to use the weekend to catch up on work, to maybe grab drinks with some college friends, to do all the normal things a young father might do with unexpected free time. Instead, he found himself having dinner with Victoria on Friday night. Just the two of them in the vast dining room that suddenly felt intimate rather than formal. Victoria had actually cooked, not just supervised the housekeeper, and the meal was perfect. Coq au vin that melted off the bone, wine from Harold's Reserve collection that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and conversation that flowed like water. "I never cook anymore," Victoria said, cutting into her chicken. "Harold always insisted we have formal service, even when it was just the two of us. Said it was important to maintain standards." She looked up at Richard. "Do you know the last time I cooked for someone I actually wanted to cook for?" Richard shook his head, mesmerized by the way the candlelight played across her face. "Never," she said simply. "This is the first time." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. This wasn't just dinner, it was a declaration. After they finished eating, Victoria suggested they move to the living room. She'd lit a fire, and the room glowed with warm light from the flames and scattered candles. It looked like a seduction scene from a movie, and Richard was pretty sure that was intentional. They sat on the sofa, closer than they should have but not as close as they wanted to. Victoria had changed after dinner, trading her conservative day dress for something flowing and soft. That seemed to catch the firelight and throw it back in golden waves. "Tell me about your dreams," she said suddenly. "What? Your dreams? The ones you had before you got caught up in being the perfect son-in-law and the responsible father. What did you want to be when you were young and still thought anything was possible?" Richard laughed, but there was sadness in it. "You'll think it's silly. Try me." He took a sip of wine, gathering courage. "I wanted to write novels, specifically. I had this whole fantasy about living in a small apartment in Paris, writing the great American novel while watching people from cafe windows." Victoria's eyes lit up. "That's not silly at all. That's beautiful. What stopped you?" "Reality, I guess. My father convinced me that writing was a hobby, not a career. Said I needed something stable, something respectable. Then I met Sarah, and her family's expectations were even higher than my father's." He looked directly at Victoria. "I became what everyone needed me to be instead of who I wanted to be." "And who did you want to be?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Someone brave enough to chase what he really wanted, I guess." Victoria reached over and took his hand. "It's not too late, you know. You're 34, not 94. There's still time to be brave." "Is there?" Richard stared down at their intertwined fingers. "I have responsibilities now. A wife, a child, a mortgage, expectations." "Harold was 68 when he died," Victoria said quietly. "Do you know what his biggest regret was, according to his diary? That he never learned to sail." "Sailing, Richard. Something he could have done any weekend for 40 years, and he never did it because he was too busy being responsible." She shifted closer to him on the sofa. "I don't want to be Harold. And I don't think you want to be Harold either." "What are you saying?" Victoria's free hand moved to cup his cheek, the same gesture that had started everything 3 weeks ago. "I'm saying that sometimes being responsible means being responsible to yourself, to your own happiness. I'm saying that life is shorter than we think and longer than we can bear when we're living it for everyone else." "Victoria, I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, and I think you're falling in love with me, and maybe that's not something we should fight." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard knew that this was the moment, the point of no return. He could pull back, make some excuse, preserve the facade of propriety. Or he could lean into the fire that had been building between them for months. He chose fire. This time when they kissed, there was nothing tentative about it. 3 weeks of suppressed desire exploded between them, and Richard found himself pulling Victoria closer, his hands tangling in her hair. His entire world narrowing to the taste of her lips and the feel of her body against his. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Richard," Victoria whispered, her voice husky. "I want you to stay tonight." He knew what she was asking. Knew what it would mean, what lines they would be crossing, what betrayals they would be committing. If I stay, he said carefully, everything changes. We can't take it back. Victoria smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. Good. I don't want to take it back. I want to feel alive again. I want to remember what it's like to be wanted, really wanted, by someone who sees me as more than just a role to play. She stood, extending her hand to him. Come upstairs with me, Richard. Let me show you what it feels like to stop performing and start living. Richard looked at her outstretched hand and thought about Sarah, probably already asleep in her friend's guest room with Emma curled up beside her. He thought about the vows he'd taken, the promises he'd made, the life he'd built on the foundation of doing what was expected rather than what he wanted. Then he thought about Victoria's confession that she'd been planning these moments, orchestrating their encounters, carefully constructing a web of intimacy designed to ensnare him. And he realized he didn't care. He took her hand. Victoria led him upstairs to the master bedroom, the room she'd shared with Harold for 25 years. The room where she'd felt invisible for more than 2 decades. Tonight, she was going to reclaim it. What happened next would shatter the Whitmore family forever, but in that moment, as Victoria closed the bedroom door behind them, neither she nor Richard was thinking about consequences. They were thinking about desire and loneliness and the intoxicating rush of finally getting what they'd been craving. Victoria Sterling had won the first round of her game. But she was about to discover that some victories come at a price higher than anyone could imagine. Because while she'd been focused on seducing her son-in-law, someone else had been watching. Someone who'd seen the lingering glances, the intimate conversations, the careful orchestration of private moments. Someone who was about to turn Victoria's carefully laid plans into a weapon that would destroy them all. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, there was only the sound of whispered confessions and the rustle of expensive sheets. As two people who'd been living half-lives finally allowed themselves to feel fully alive. Even if it meant burning everything else to the ground. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of brutal sunshine that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. Richard woke up in Victoria's bed, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings and the weight of what he'd done. Pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. Victoria was already awake, sitting by the window in a silk robe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked different in the morning light, not older, exactly, but more complex. The vulnerability she'd shown the night before was gone, replaced by something harder, more calculating. Good morning, she said without turning around. Richard sat up, suddenly very aware of his nakedness, of the intimacy that had seemed so natural in the darkness but felt exposed and dangerous in the daylight. Victoria, about last night. Regrets already? She finally turned to look at him, and her smile was sharp. How disappointing. No, not regrets. Not exactly. Richard ran a hand through his hair. It's just complicated. Victoria stood and moved to her vanity, beginning the ritual of putting on her makeup with practiced precision. It's only complicated if you make it complicated, darling. What happened between us was inevitable. We're both adults. We both got what we wanted. The casual dismissal stung more than Richard had expected. Is that all this was to you? Getting what you wanted? Victoria paused in applying her lipstick, meeting his eyes in the mirror. What did you think it was? True love? A romantic fairy tale? She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Richard, you're a handsome man going through a midlife crisis at 34, and I'm a lonely widow who's tired of being invisible. We scratched each other's itches. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. But even as she said it, Victoria's hands trembled slightly. Because it had been more complicated than that, at least for her. The night with Richard had awakened something she'd thought was dead, not just physical desire, but emotional hunger. For the first time in decades, she'd felt seen, valued, wanted for herself rather than for what she could provide. And that terrified her more than she was willing to admit. Richard got dressed in silence, processing Victoria's words. Part of him was relieved by her pragmatic approach. It made what they'd done seem less like a betrayal and more like a momentary lapse in judgment. But another part of him was hurt by her dismissal, by the reduction of something that had felt profound to a simple transaction. Sarah comes back tomorrow evening, Victoria said as she finished her makeup. I suggest we both use today to get our heads straight. Richard nodded, though he wondered if his head would ever be straight again. What happens now? Do we pretend this never happened? Victoria stood and walked to him, smoothing down his collar with an intimacy that felt both maternal and sexual. We go back to our lives. You go back to being the devoted husband and father. I go back to being the helpful mother-in-law. And maybe, if we're both very discreet and very careful, we find opportunities to continue our friendship. The euphemism hung in the air between them. Richard knew she was offering him an affair, not a relationship. Not a future, but a series of stolen moments and secret encounters that would have to sustain him through the performance of his regular life. He should have said no. Should have told her that one night was enough, that he couldn't live with the deception, that they needed to end this before it destroyed everything. Instead, he found himself nodding. Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her that morning. Good. Now go home, Richard. Take a shower, change your clothes, and think about what story you'll tell Sarah about your weekend. Richard left through the back entrance, a precaution they both understood without discussing. He drove home through streets that looked exactly the same but felt fundamentally different. As if the world had shifted slightly off its axis while he wasn't paying attention. What he didn't know was that someone had been paying very close attention indeed. Margaret Chen had been the Whitmore family's housekeeper for 8 years. She was invisible in the way that good help always is, so seamlessly integrated into the household routine that the family members often forgot she was there. She saw everything, heard everything, and understood far more than anyone gave her credit for. Margaret had been working late on Friday, finishing up some ironing in the laundry room that adjoined the kitchen when she'd witnessed Richard and Victoria's intimate dinner. She'd seen the way they looked at each other, heard the undertones in their conversation, and recognized the careful choreography of seduction. But it was what she'd observed Saturday morning that had truly shocked her. Margaret had arrived early to prepare the house for Sarah's return, using her key to enter through the service door as she had hundreds of times before. She'd been in the kitchen, starting coffee, when she'd seen Richard leaving through the back garden disheveled, wearing yesterday's clothes, moving with the careful casualness of someone who didn't want to be observed. 15 minutes later, Victoria had come downstairs in her robe, glowing with the unmistakable satisfaction of a woman who'd spent the night being thoroughly satisfied. Margaret was a practical woman. She'd immigrated from Taiwan 20 years ago, worked multiple jobs to put herself through community college, and built a reputation as the most discreet and reliable domestic worker in Beacon Hill. She understood that wealthy families had complicated dynamics. And she'd learned long ago that her job security depended on seeing nothing, hearing nothing, and saying nothing. But this was different. This wasn't just family drama, this was betrayal of the worst kind. Sarah Whitmore had always been kind to Margaret, had remembered her birthday and asked about her daughter's college applications, and treated her like a human being rather than a piece of furniture. Margaret owed Sarah more than silence. The question was what to do with the information. Confronting Victoria or Richard directly would accomplish nothing except getting herself fired. Going to Sarah immediately seemed cruel. The poor woman was just starting to recover from her postpartum depression, finally beginning to seem like herself again. But doing nothing felt like complicity. Margaret made her decision as she watched Victoria come downstairs that Saturday morning, humming under her breath with a lightness that hadn't been there in months. She would wait, watch, and gather more evidence. If this was a one-time mistake born of loneliness and opportunity, perhaps it would end on its own. But if it continued, if Victoria and Richard were planning to carry on an affair under Sarah's nose, then Margaret would find a way to make sure Sarah knew the truth. Because Margaret Chen had learned long ago that secrets were like cancer. They might stay hidden for a while, but eventually, they always found a way to surface. And when they did, they destroyed everything in their path. What Margaret didn't realize was that she wasn't the only one who'd noticed the change in household dynamics. Emma, at 6 months old, was too young to understand what she was seeing, but she'd begun to sense the shift in energy between the adults around her. More importantly, Sarah herself was beginning to emerge from her postpartum fog. And while she might not have been consciously aware of what was happening between her husband and mother, something deep in her intuition was starting to send up warning signals. The Whitmore family was sitting on a powder keg, and everyone involved was about to learn that some secrets are too big to contain. Margaret continued her work, cleaning and organizing with mechanical precision while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. She dusted the living room where Richard and Victoria had shared their intimate dinner. Noting the wine glasses that hadn't made it to the kitchen, the candles burned down to nothing, the throw pillows arranged as if someone had been lying on the sofa. Evidence. All of it evidence of something that would devastate an innocent woman and destroy a family. Margaret had 48 hours until Sarah's return to decide what kind of person she was going to be, someone who protected her employer's secrets, or someone who protected her employer's heart. She was about to discover that some choices define not just who you are, but who you're willing to become in order to live with yourself. And in a house where everyone was keeping secrets, Margaret Chen was about to become the most dangerous person of all, a truth teller in a world built on lies. Sarah returned from Providence on Sunday evening with Emma in her arms and something resembling joy in her eyes for the first time in months. The weekend away had done exactly what everyone hoped. She looked rested, more like her old self, ready to re-engage with her life. "I missed you both so much," she said, kissing Richard at the door before handing Emma to Victoria. "Mom, you look wonderful. Did you do something different with your hair?" Victoria's hand automatically went to her hair, which she had indeed styled differently that morning, softer, more romantic, the way Richard had complimented it the night before. "Just trying something new, darling." The next few weeks fell into a routine that was both completely normal and utterly artificial. On the surface, the Whitmore household functioned exactly as it always had. Richard went to work, Sarah tended to Emma and slowly began reclaiming her social life. And Victoria played the role of helpful grandmother and gracious hostess. But underneath, a different drama was unfolding. Richard and Victoria had become masters of stolen moments. A brush of hands when passing in the hallway. Meaningful glances across the dinner table. Text messages that could have been innocent if you didn't know to look for the subtext. "Picked up your dry cleaning. It's hanging in the guest room closet." Innocent enough, until you realized it was Victoria's way of telling Richard where to meet her that afternoon while Sarah was at her book club. "Thanks for the wine recommendation. We'll try it tonight." Richard's code for accepting her invitation. They were careful, so careful. Never in the main bedroom. Never when Sarah was in the house. Never leaving physical evidence of their encounters. But careful wasn't the same as invisible, and Margaret Chen saw everything. She watched Richard linger in rooms where Victoria was working. She noticed Victoria's sudden interest in grocery shopping, which always seemed to coincide with Richard's lunch breaks. She observed the way they unconsciously mirrored each other's body language during family dinners. The way their conversation had developed its own rhythm and inside jokes that excluded Sarah. Most damning of all, she saw the way they looked at each other. When they thought no one was watching, with a heat and intimacy that no mother-in-law and son-in-law should ever share. Margaret's breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in early May. Sarah had taken Emma to a pediatrician appointment, and Margaret was upstairs changing linens when she heard voices from the guest room. Not just talking, laughing, intimate conversation punctuated by the unmistakable sounds of physical passion. She stood frozen in the hallway, laundry basket in her arms. Listening to her employer's husband and mother-in-law betraying Sarah in the most fundamental way possible. When she finally heard them getting dressed and preparing to leave the room, Margaret slipped quickly into the master bedroom, her heart pounding. She heard them in the hallway, Victoria's voice low and satisfied. Richard's deeper tones tinged with something that might have been guilt or might have been regret. "Same time tomorrow?" Victoria asked. "Sarah has that charity meeting," Richard confirmed. "Perfect." Margaret waited until she heard their footsteps fade before emerging from the bedroom. She walked to the guest room and saw exactly what she expected: rumpled sheets. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with cologne, and pillows that told the story of what had happened there. That night, Margaret lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with her conscience. She'd been putting off the decision for weeks, telling herself she needed more evidence, more certainty. But there was no more evidence to gather. Richard and Victoria were having an affair, and they were becoming bolder about it with each passing day. Sarah deserved to know, but knowing would destroy her. Margaret had seen enough family implosions in her 20 years of domestic work to understand that some truths were weapons of mass destruction. Once this particular bomb detonated, there would be nothing left of the Whitmore family but rubble and recrimination. Still, Sarah deserved the choice. Deserved the opportunity to make decisions about her life based on truth rather than deception. Margaret made her decision as the sun rose on Friday morning. She would tell Sarah, but she would do it carefully, gently, with as much compassion as possible. She arrived at work that morning with a heavy heart and a plan forming in her mind. She'd decided to document what she could not intimate moments, which would have been too invasive and potentially illegal, but evidence of their meetings, their coordination. The small details that painted a clear picture of deception. But fate had other plans. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard the front door slam with unusual force. Sarah's voice echoed through the house, sharp with panic. "Richard, Mom, anyone?" Margaret rushed to the foyer to find Sarah standing there with Emma in her car seat, her face white with shock and her hands shaking. "Mrs. Whitmore, what's wrong?" Margaret asked, immediately taking Emma's carrier. "I forgot my checkbook for the charity meeting," Sarah said, her voice oddly flat. "I came back to get it and I heard." She trailed off, staring up the stairs toward the guest room where sounds of intimacy were still faintly audible. Margaret's blood turned to ice. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began carefully, but Sarah was already moving toward the stairs. "That's my husband's voice," Sarah said, more to herself than to Margaret. "That's Richard's voice, and he's supposed to be at work, and he's upstairs with." Understanding dawned in her eyes like a sunrise, terrible and illuminating. Oh God, no." Margaret watched helplessly as Sarah climbed the stairs, each step measured and deliberate, like someone walking to her own execution. Emma began to fuss in her carrier, as if sensing the emotional earthquake about to shatter her small world. Sarah paused outside the guest room door, her hand on the knob. Margaret could see her from the bottom of the stairs, frozen between ignorance and knowledge, between the life she thought she had and the life she was about to discover. Then Sarah opened the door. The scream that followed was inhuman, primal, the sound of a heart breaking in real time. It was followed by Richard's voice, panicked and desperate. And Victoria's, sharp with surprise and something that might have been annoyance at being interrupted. "Sarah. Jesus, Sarah, it's not what." "Don't." Sarah's voice cut through his protests like a blade. "Don't you dare tell me it's not what it looks like. Don't you dare insult my intelligence on top of everything else." Margaret heard movement upstairs, the sound of frantic dressing, Richard's voice trying to explain. And Sarah's voice getting higher and more hysterical with each word. "How long?" Sarah demanded. "How long have you been screwing my mother behind my back? Sarah, please, let me explain. How long?" The silence stretched for an eternity before Victoria's voice, calm and collected, provided the answer that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. "Since March." Another silence, this one filled with the weight of calculations. March. While Sarah was struggling with postpartum depression. While she was at her most vulnerable, her most in need of support from the two people she trusted most in the world. 2 months, Sarah whispered. 2 months of lying to my face. 2 months of pretending to care about me while you were. Her voice broke entirely. Margaret heard footsteps, then Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, her face streaked with tears but her voice deadly calm. "Pack your things, Richard. I want you out of this house within the hour. Sarah, please, we need to talk about this. We needed to talk about this 2 months ago." Sarah's composure cracked, revealing the rage beneath. "We needed to talk about this before you decided my mother was more interesting than your wife. We needed to talk about this before you decided to betray our marriage vows in the same house where your daughter sleeps." Victoria appeared in the doorway behind Richard, fully dressed now, her hair perfect despite what had just transpired. Her face showed no shame, no remorse, only a slight irritation at having her afternoon disrupted. "Sarah, darling," she began in that same patronizing tone she'd used when Sarah was a child, "you're being hysterical. If you'd just calm down and let us explain." "Explain?" Sarah turned to her mother with such fury that Victoria actually stepped back. "Explain how you seduced my husband. Explain how you used your grief over Dad as an excuse to destroy my marriage. Explain how you looked me in the eye every day for 2 months while you were sleeping with the father of your granddaughter. Victoria's mask finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Your father died 3 years ago, Sarah. 3 years of being alone, of being invisible, of watching you take for granted everything I never had. Did you really think I was going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for the scraps of affection you threw my way? The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Victoria hadn't just betrayed Sarah, she'd resented her for years, had been planning this destruction out of jealousy and spite. Sarah stared at her mother as if seeing her for the first time. You're sick. You're actually sick. I'm alive, Victoria snapped back. For the first time in decades, I'm actually alive. And if that threatens you, if that challenges your perfect little world, then maybe your perfect little world needed challenging. Richard, who had been standing between the two women like a deer in headlights, finally found his voice. Sarah, I love you. What happened with Victoria, it was a mistake, it was. It was 2 months, Sarah interrupted. 2 months isn't a mistake, Richard. It's a choice. It's a series of choices, made over and over again, every single day. She looked between them, these two people who had been her entire support system, her whole world. You chose her over me. Over Emma. Over our family. Margaret, still standing in the foyer holding Emma, watched this family destroy itself from the inside out. She'd thought she was prepared for this moment, had imagined how it might unfold, but the reality was so much worse than anything she could have conceived. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, like an old woman, aged decades in the span of minutes. She took Emma from Margaret without a word, her hands gentle with her daughter despite the violence of her shaking. 1 hour, she said without looking back up the stairs. I want you both gone in 1 hour. Richard, you can come back for your things when I'm not here. Mom. She paused, the words seeming to catch in her throat. Victoria, I never want to see you again. Margaret watched Sarah carry her daughter into the living room, her back straight with the kind of dignity that only comes from having nothing left to lose. Upstairs, she could hear Richard and Victoria talking in urgent whispers, their affair already fracturing under the weight of its exposure. The Whitmore family was over. Not damaged, not troubled completely, irrevocably destroyed. And Margaret Chen, who had spent weeks agonizing over whether to reveal the truth, realized that some secrets are too big to keep buried. They find their own way to the surface, usually at the worst possible moment, in the most devastating way imaginable. Within the hour, Richard had packed a bag and left for a hotel. Victoria, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, would soon discover that her victory had cost her everything she'd thought she was fighting for. But the real casualties were still to come. Because Sarah Whitmore was about to learn that when your world implodes, the wreckage doesn't disappear, it transforms into something else entirely. Something dangerous. 3 weeks after the discovery, Sarah Whitmore sat in the offices of Brennan, Shaw and Associates, the most ruthless divorce attorneys in Boston. With a stack of financial documents that painted a very different picture of her marriage than she'd ever imagined. Your husband has been systematically hiding assets for over a year, Jonathan Brennan said, sliding another set of papers across his mahogany desk. Offshore accounts, investment properties purchased under shell companies, cryptocurrency wallets. He's been planning this for a long time, Mrs. Whitmore. Sarah stared at the evidence of Richard's deception, feeling numb. The affair had been devastating enough, but this financial betrayal cut even deeper. While she'd been struggling with new motherhood, Richard had been carefully constructing a web of hidden wealth designed to minimize what she could claim in a divorce. How much? She asked quietly. Conservative estimate? He's hidden approximately $2.8 million. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. They'd been living modestly, or so she'd thought, careful with expenses, planning for Emma's future, being responsible. Meanwhile, Richard had been stockpiling money like he was preparing for war. There's more, Brennan continued. The timing of these transactions suggests he may have been planning to leave you even before the affair with your mother began. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think this was a crime of passion. I think this was calculated from the beginning. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd been telling herself that Richard had been seduced, that Victoria had somehow manipulated him into betrayal. But the evidence suggested something far worse, that Richard had been planning to abandon his family all along. And Victoria had simply provided him with a convenient excuse. What are my options? She asked. Brennan smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Given the adultery, the hidden assets, and the fact that you have a minor child, we can make his life very expensive. Very expensive indeed. While Sarah was discovering the depths of her husband's duplicity, Richard was learning that his carefully constructed escape plan had some fatal flaws. He'd rented a furnished apartment in the Back Bay, a soulless corporate housing unit that felt like a hotel room pretending to be a home. Victoria had been staying there with him since Sarah's ultimatum, but the arrangement was already showing cracks. "This is temporary," Victoria said for the dozenth time, standing at the window overlooking a parking lot instead of the garden view she was accustomed to. "We need to make long-term plans." Richard looked up from his laptop, where he'd been frantically trying to move money before Sarah's lawyers could freeze his accounts. He was too late, they'd already found everything, and his phone had been ringing all morning, with calls from banks and investment firms confirming that his assets were now tied up in legal proceedings. "What long-term plans?" he asked, exhaustion making his voice sharp. "Sarah's going to take everything. The house, Emma, half of whatever money I can't hide. And now that she knows about the hidden accounts, she'll probably get more than half." Victoria turned from the window, her face showing the first signs of real concern. "What do you mean, everything? Surely she can't." "She can, and she will." Richard's laugh was bitter. "Adultery isn't looked upon favorably by family court judges, especially when there are hidden assets involved. And the fact that you're her mother makes it worse. Much worse." The reality of their situation was beginning to dawn on Victoria. She'd been living in Richard's penthouse apartment in her mind, imagining a life of freedom and passion, funded by his successful career and her own inheritance. She hadn't considered that actions have consequences, that choices require payment. "What about your job?" she asked. Richard's silence was answer enough. When news of the affair had spread through their social circle and in Beacon Hill, news traveled at the speed of light. His position at the investment firm had become untenable. The partners had made it clear that his personal complications were affecting the company's reputation. He had 2 weeks to find another position or face termination. "And my inheritance?" Victoria's voice was smaller now, less certain. "Also complicated." Richard pulled up another set of documents on his laptop. "Apparently, your late husband's will includes a morality clause. If you engage in behavior that brings shame to the family name, the trustees can withhold distributions." Victoria sank into the cheap rental furniture, the weight of her situation finally crushing her carefully maintained composure. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your affair with me could cost you access to Harold's money. I'm saying that we may both end up with nothing." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of dreams dying. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen was making a discovery that would change everything. She'd continued working for Sarah, partly out of loyalty and partly because Sarah needed all the support she could get. While cleaning out Richard's home office, a task Sarah couldn't bear to do herself, Margaret had found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind family photos in Richard's desk drawer was a letter. Not a love letter, something far worse. It was correspondence from a private investigator, dated 8 months earlier, detailing Sarah's postpartum depression, her vulnerability, her isolation. The report read like a strategic assessment of the best time to abandon a wife and child with minimum financial impact. But the most damaging revelation was in the final paragraph. Subject's relationship with her mother appears to be the primary source of emotional support. Disrupting this relationship would leave subject completely isolated and potentially more willing to accept unfavorable divorce terms. Margaret stared at the letter, understanding flooding through her like ice water. This hadn't been a spontaneous affair or even a calculated seduction. This had been psychological warfare. Richard had hired a private investigator to study his own wife's weaknesses. He'd identified her relationship with her mother as her strongest support system. And then he'd systematically destroyed it by seducing Victoria, knowing that the revelation would devastate Sarah on multiple levels. He hadn't just betrayed his wife, he'd weaponized her own mother against her. Margaret photocopied the letter and drove immediately to Brennan, Shaw and Associates. When she handed the evidence to Jonathan Brennan, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "you may have just won this case." Sarah was in the nursery, rocking Emma to sleep, when her phone rang. Brennan's voice was practically vibrating with excitement. "Sarah, we need to talk. Immediately. Your housekeeper found something that changes everything." An hour later, Sarah sat in Brennan's office, reading the private investigator's report with a mixture of horror and rage that surprised her with its intensity. "He planned all of this," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "The affair, the timing, using my mother against me, it was all planned." "More than that," Brennan said. "This constitutes fraud, emotional manipulation, and potentially criminal conspiracy. Richard didn't just cheat on you, he orchestrated a campaign designed to psychologically destroy you." Sarah looked up from the report, and Brennan saw something in her eyes that made him take a step back. The broken, vulnerable woman who'd walked into his office 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. "What's the most damage we can do to him?" she asked. "With this evidence? We can destroy him completely. Financially, professionally, personally. He'll be lucky if he avoids criminal charges." Sarah smiled, and it was nothing like the gentle expression Brennan had seen from her before. "Good. Do it." But Sarah wasn't done. If Richard had taught her anything, it was that sometimes the most devastating attacks come from people you trust implicitly. Victoria was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Because Sarah had discovered something else in her research, Harold Sterling's will didn't just have a morality clause. It had a clause that allowed his daughter to petition the trustees for a full review of distributions. If she believed the beneficiary was acting contrary to the family's interests. And Sarah was about to petition for a review that would strip Victoria of her inheritance entirely. The war between the Whitmore women was just beginning, and it would be fought with weapons that could destroy them all. But first, Sarah had a phone call to make. To someone who would be very interested to learn about Richard's private investigator and the evidence of premeditated fraud. Someone at the district attorney's office. The criminal charges hit Richard like an avalanche in late June. Conspiracy to commit fraud, premeditated financial deception, violation of fiduciary duty. The district attorney's office had taken Sarah's evidence and run with it, building a case that painted Richard not just as an unfaithful husband, but as a predator who had systematically planned the psychological destruction of his wife for financial gain. The story exploded across Boston's society pages like a bomb. Investment executive charged with conspiracy against own wife. Beacon Hill affair reveals deeper criminal plot. Mother-in-law affair was cover for elaborate fraud scheme. Richard's career was over. His reputation was in ashes. His assets remained frozen while the criminal case proceeded. And Victoria, watching the news coverage from their increasingly desperate corporate apartment, was beginning to realize that she'd been as manipulated as Sarah. "You used me," she said, her voice flat with realization. "The whole time, you were using me to hurt Sarah." Richard, unshaven and hollow-eyed from weeks of legal stress, didn't bother denying it. "Does it matter now? We're both screwed." "It matters to me." Victoria's voice was gaining strength. "It matters because I thought you wanted me. I thought I was finally worth something to someone." Richard laughed bitterly. "You were worth something. You were worth $2.8 million in hidden assets and a destroyed wife who might have settled quietly. But Sarah turned out to be stronger than we thought." The cruelty of his words hit Victoria like a slap. She'd sacrificed her relationship with her daughter, her social standing, her inheritance, and her self-respect for a man who had seen her as nothing more than a tool to be used against her own child. "I destroyed my daughter for you," she whispered. "You destroyed your daughter for yourself," Richard shot back. "Don't rewrite history now. You wanted to feel young again, wanted to feel desired, wanted to feel like you mattered. I gave you that. The fact that it served my purposes too doesn't make it less real." Victoria stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time since their affair began. Richard Whitmore was a sociopath. A handsome, charming sociopath who had identified her vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. Just like he'd done with Sarah. Just like he'd probably done with every woman he'd ever been involved with. "Oh God," Victoria breathed. "What have I done?" But Richard was already moving past the conversation, focused on his own survival. "The question isn't what you've done. The question is what you're going to do now. Because Sarah isn't finished with this yet." He was right. Sarah's campaign of destruction was just getting started. The petition to review Victoria's inheritance had been filed. And the Sterling family trustees were not pleased with the negative publicity surrounding their beneficiary. Harold Sterling had been a pillar of Boston society. His name was on hospital wings and university buildings. Having his widow involved in a criminal conspiracy scandal was unacceptable. Victoria received the letter on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to the corporate apartment that had become her prison. Upon review of recent events and in accordance with the morality provisions of Harold Sterling's last will and testament, the trustees regret to inform you that your monthly distributions will be suspended pending a full investigation into your conduct. Suspended, not reduced, not temporarily delayed. Suspended. Victoria's hands shook as she read the formal language that spelled out her financial ruin. Without the inheritance payments, she had nothing. Her own family money had been exhausted years ago, spent on maintaining the lifestyle that Harold's wealth had supported. She'd never worked, never developed any skills beyond being a rich man's wife and a society hostess. At 48, she was discovering what it meant to have nothing and no one. The final blow came that evening, in the form of a phone call from Sarah. Victoria almost didn't answer, but something masochistic curiosity, perhaps, or desperate hope for reconciliation made her pick up. "Hello, Mom." The word, Mom, was delivered with such cold precision that it sounded more like a curse than a term of endearment. "Sarah," Victoria began, but her daughter cut her off. "I'm calling to let you know that Emma and I are moving to California. I've accepted a position with a tech company in San Francisco. We leave next week." The words hit Victoria harder than any of the legal or financial devastation. "Sarah, please. She's my granddaughter. You can't." "I can't what?" "Protect my daughter from the woman who destroyed her family. The woman who conspired with my husband to psychologically torture me." Sarah's voice was ice-cold steel. "Actually, Mom, I can do exactly that. I didn't know about the private investigator," Victoria said desperately. "I swear to you, I didn't know Richard had planned any of it. I thought he loved me." Sarah's laugh was without humor. "Oh, I know you didn't know. Because you were too narcissistic, too self-absorbed, too hungry for attention to see that you were being used. Just like you were too selfish to care that seducing my husband would destroy me." Victoria began to cry, the first real tears she'd shed since this nightmare began. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake." "You made a series of choices," Sarah corrected. "And now you get to live with the consequences. Just like I'm living with mine. What about forgiveness? What about family? What about family?" Sarah's voice rose with genuine fury. "You want to talk about family? Let me tell you about family, Mom. Family doesn't sleep with their daughter's husband. Family doesn't destroy their child's marriage for their own selfish gratification. Family doesn't choose their own pathetic midlife crisis over their grandchild's stability." Victoria sobbed into the phone, all her composure finally crumbling. "I have nothing left, Sarah. No money, no home, no one. Please don't take Emma away from me too." The silence stretched for so long that Victoria thought Sarah had hung up. "Then, you should have thought about that before you chose Richard over me." The line went dead. Victoria sat in the cheap apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of her life, and realized that she had achieved the exact opposite of everything she'd thought she wanted. She'd wanted to feel alive instead, she felt dead inside. She'd wanted to be seen instead, she was infamous, notorious, a cautionary tale. She'd wanted passion instead, she'd been coldly manipulated by a sociopath who'd never felt anything for her beyond strategic utility. Richard emerged from the bedroom, where he'd been listening to her conversation with Sarah. "So she's taking the kid to California," he said with remarkable callousness for someone discussing his own daughter. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. He felt nothing. No remorse for destroying his marriage, no grief over losing his daughter, no guilt about the chain of devastation he'd caused. He was a predator, and she'd been his accomplice. "Get out," she said quietly. "What? Get out?" Victoria's voice was stronger now. "Find somewhere else to stay. I can't look at you anymore." Richard shrugged, already mentally moving on to his next scheme, his next target. "Fine. This place depresses me anyway." He packed his few belongings and left without another word, leaving Victoria alone with the weight of what she'd done. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean of the day's sins while new ones were already being planned in the shadows. But Victoria's story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes, when you've lost everything and have nothing left to lose, you discover reserves of strength you never knew you had. And sometimes, the only redemption available is the kind that comes at the ultimate price. Victoria Sterling was about to embark on the most important mission of her life, one that would either destroy her completely or give her the only thing left worth fighting for, the possibility of earning her daughter's forgiveness, even if she could never forgive herself. But first, she had to survive the darkness that was coming. Because Richard Whitmore wasn't done with the Whitmore women yet. And his final gambit would be the most dangerous of all. 6 months later, the Whitmore mansion stood empty, its windows dark and lifeless. The "for sale" sign on the perfectly manicured lawn told only part of the story. The real story was written in court documents, police reports, and newspaper headlines that had followed the family's destruction from Beacon Hill to California and back again. Richard Whitmore sat in a minimum security federal prison, serving a 3-year sentence for conspiracy to commit fraud. His cellmate was a former pharmaceutical executive who'd embezzled money from his own company. They had a lot to talk about. The conviction had been almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his premeditated scheme to destroy his wife's psychological stability for financial gain, Richard had taken a plea deal rather than risk a trial that could have resulted in a decade behind bars. His lawyer had painted him as a man who'd made poor choices under pressure, but the private investigator's report had made that defense impossible to maintain. The prosecution had been relentless in demonstrating that Richard's actions constituted a calculated campaign of psychological warfare against his own family. The civil case had been even more devastating. Sarah's lawyers had obtained a judgment that stripped Richard of virtually every asset he'd hidden, plus punitive damages that ensured he'd be paying for his crimes for the rest of his life. But money couldn't repair the deeper damage he'd caused. Sarah Whitmore, now Sarah Sterling, having reclaimed her maiden name, had rebuilt her life in San Francisco with the kind of methodical determination that comes from having survived absolute betrayal. The tech job had turned into a partnership opportunity, and she'd discovered a talent for strategic thinking that probably shouldn't have surprised anyone who'd watched her systematically destroy her ex-husband's life. Emma, now almost 2 years old, had no memory of the father who'd been willing to sacrifice her emotional stability for financial gain. Sarah intended to keep it that way. Victoria, meanwhile, had discovered what rock bottom actually looked like. After losing her inheritance, her home, and her daughter, she'd moved into a studio apartment in Dorchester, a far cry from the mansion in Beacon Hill. She'd taken the only job she could find, working at a coffee shop frequented by students from Emerson College. At 48, Victoria Sterling learned to make lattes and clean tables and count register drawers. She learned what it meant to be invisible, not because she was taken for granted, but because she truly didn't matter to the people around her. The customers barely saw her. Her coworkers, mostly college students, were polite but distant. She existed on the periphery of other people's lives, serving coffee and wiping down tables. Watching young people fall in love and break up and plan their futures while her own past consumed her present. But invisibility, Victoria discovered, had its advantages. It gave her time to think, time to understand, time to plan. And Victoria Sterling had a plan. She'd been writing letters to Sarah for months, letters she never sent. Hundreds of them, each one an attempt to explain, to apologize, to find the words that might begin to heal the damage she'd caused. She'd thrown them all away. Because apologies were just words, and words had already done enough damage. If Victoria wanted redemption, she would have to earn it through actions. Which was why, on a cold December evening, she was standing outside a modern office building in downtown Boston, waiting for Richard's parole officer to finish his day. James Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the Massachusetts Parole Department who'd seen every kind of criminal and heard every kind of sob story. When Victoria Sterling requested a meeting, he'd almost declined. The former socialite who'd been involved in the Whitmore scandal wasn't his client, and he had no obligation to see her. But something in her voice, a determination that cut through her obvious desperation, had made him curious. "Mrs. Sterling," he said as she approached his car in the parking garage. "You said this was about Richard Whitmore?" Victoria handed him a manila envelope without preamble. "He's planning to violate his parole." Morrison opened the envelope and found photographs, recordings, and documentation that painted a disturbing picture. Richard, scheduled for release in 18 months, had been using prison connections to plan his next scheme. He's been in contact with someone who specializes in helping men disappear after domestic crimes, Victoria explained. New identity, offshore accounts, relocation assistance. He's planning to skip parole and track down Sarah and Emma. Morrison studied the evidence, his expression growing darker with each page. How did you get this information? I've been corresponding with him. Victoria's voice was steady, though her hands shook slightly. He thinks I'm still his ally. He thinks I'm still angry at Sarah for destroying our lives. He's been sharing his plans because he wants me to help him. The recordings were the most damning evidence. Victoria had secretly recorded phone conversations where Richard detailed his fantasies of revenge against Sarah, his plans to kidnap Emma. His certainty that he could manipulate the legal system once again. He's a sociopath, Victoria continued. I was too blind to see it before, too caught up in my own selfishness. But I see it now. And I know that if he gets out of prison on schedule, he will hurt my daughter and granddaughter. Morrison looked at Victoria with new interest. Why are you bringing this to me? Why not go to the FBI directly? Victoria met his gaze steadily. Because I need to know that Richard will serve his full sentence and then some. I need to know that by the time he's released, Sarah and Emma will be so far away and so well protected that he'll never find them. And what do you get out of this? Victoria's smile was sad but determined. I get to do one thing right. After a lifetime of selfish choices, I get to make one choice that's entirely about protecting the people I love instead of gratifying myself. Morrison nodded slowly. This wasn't redemption. Victoria Sterling would never be forgiven for her role in destroying her daughter's marriage. But it was responsibility, finally taken at the moment when it could do the most good. The evidence Victoria provided led to additional federal charges against Richard. Conspiracy to violate parole conditions, planning to commit kidnapping across state lines, making terroristic threats. His 3-year sentence became 8 years, and his parole conditions would be so restrictive that any attempt to contact Sarah or Emma would result in immediate re-imprisonment. Victoria never told Sarah about her intervention. Some gifts are best given anonymously. Instead, she wrote one final letter not to Sarah, but to Emma, to be opened on her 18th birthday. My dearest Emma, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand that adults sometimes make choices that hurt the people they love most. I made such choices, and they cost me the most important relationship in my life, my relationship with your mother. I cannot undo the damage I caused. I cannot take back the pain I inflicted. I cannot restore the family that my selfishness destroyed. But I could ensure that the man who manipulated me into hurting your mother would never have the chance to hurt you. I know I have no right to ask for your understanding or your forgiveness. I know that my actions cost you the chance to know your grandmother as anything other than a cautionary tale. But I want you to know that the love I felt for you and your mother was the only real thing in a life full of performance and pretense. And protecting you both from further harm was the only truly unselfish choice I ever made. I hope you grow up to be as strong as your mother and as kind as she used to be before I broke her heart. All my love, Victoria. P.S. I've established a trust fund for your college education. It's the only money I have left, but it's the only inheritance I can give you that isn't tainted by the choices that destroyed our family. Victoria sealed the letter and gave it to her lawyer with instructions for delivery. Then she disappeared. Not dramatically, not mysteriously. She simply faded away, leaving Boston behind for a small town in Vermont where nobody knew her story and nobody cared about her past. She took a job at a local library, rented a small apartment over a bakery, and learned what it meant to live quietly, without drama. Without schemes, without the need to be seen or desired or envied. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling became genuinely invisible and discovered that invisibility, when chosen rather than imposed, could be a kind of peace. Sarah and Emma thrived in California. Sarah's business grew into one of the most successful tech consulting firms on the West Coast. Emma grew up strong and happy, surrounded by her mother's chosen family of friends and colleagues who provided all the love and stability that blood relatives had failed to deliver. Richard served his full sentence and was released into a world that had moved on without him. His parole restrictions made it impossible for him to travel or use the internet unsupervised. He took a job at an auto parts store in Ohio and learned that some sins follow you forever. Margaret Chen remained in Boston, working for a series of families who never appreciated her discretion quite as much as Sarah had. She kept the secret of Victoria's final sacrifice, understanding that some stories are too complex for simple telling. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret would think about the Whitmore family and wonder if there had been any way to save them all. If she'd spoken up sooner, acted differently, intervened before the damage became irreversible. But she'd learned that you can't save people from themselves. You can only bear witness to their choices and hope that somewhere in the wreckage, someone finds a way to build something better. The Whitmore mansion was eventually purchased by a young couple with twin daughters and a golden retriever. They painted the walls bright colors, filled the rooms with laughter, and never knew that their home had once been the stage for a tragedy that destroyed 3 generations. But sometimes, in the guest room where Richard and Victoria had betrayed everything they should have held sacred, the new owners reported feeling an inexplicable sadness, as if the walls themselves remembered what love looked like when it curdled into poison. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some secrets are too big to contain, some betrayals too deep to forgive, some choices too destructive to survive. But sometimes, in the ashes of absolute devastation, people find ways to build new lives from the rubble of their old ones. And sometimes, the most powerful form of love is the kind that protects from a distance, asks for nothing in return, and accepts that some damage can never be undone, only prevented from spreading further. Victoria Sterling learned that lesson too late to save her family, but just in time to save her soul. In the end, the forbidden attraction that had promised to make her feel alive had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that real love isn't about taking what you want, it's about giving up what you want for the sake of those you love. The price of that lesson was everything she'd held dear. But for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling could look at herself in the mirror and see someone worth respecting, even if she was the only one who would ever know it. Epilogue 5 years later. Emma Sterling, now 7 years old, stood in the doorway of her mother's home office in their Marin County house, watching Sarah work on her laptop while afternoon sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Mommy," Emma said, "Mrs. Patterson at school says everyone has grandparents. Where are mine?" Sarah looked up from her computer, her heart catching slightly. They'd had versions of this conversation before, but Emma was getting older, more curious, harder to deflect with simple answers. "Well," Sarah said carefully, "your grandfather died before you were born, and your grandmother. Your grandmother made some choices that hurt our family very badly. Sometimes adults make mistakes so big that they can't be forgiven." Emma considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing complex information. "What kind of mistakes?" Sarah closed her laptop and pulled Emma onto her lap, breathing in the scent of her daughter's shampoo and marveling at how this perfect little person had emerged from such destruction. "The kind of mistakes that happen when people think more about what they want than about who they might hurt," Sarah said finally. "Will I ever meet her?" The question Sarah had been dreading for years. She thought about the trust fund that had appeared mysteriously in Emma's name, administered by lawyers who refused to reveal the donor's identity. She thought about the private investigator's reports that confirmed Richard was still serving his extended sentence, and would likely remain incarcerated for several more years. She thought about the unsigned birthday cards that arrived every year, postmarked from Vermont, containing nothing but a pressed wildflower and a simple, "Happy birthday, Emma," in elegant handwriting. Someone was watching over them from a distance. Someone who cared enough to ensure their safety but respected their boundaries enough to remain invisible. "I don't know, baby," Sarah said honestly. "Maybe someday, when you're older, you can decide if you want to try to find her. But for now, we have each other, and we have our chosen family, and that's enough." Emma nodded and returned to her coloring books, already moving on to more immediate concerns like whether they were having pancakes or waffles for breakfast tomorrow. But Sarah sat in her office for a long time after Emma left, staring out at the California hills and wondering if Victoria Sterling was still alive. Still thinking about the granddaughter she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Still living with the weight of choices that had seemed so appealing in the moment and proved so devastating in the aftermath. Somewhere in Vermont, in a small apartment above a bakery, Victoria Sterling was wondering the same thing. She'd built a quiet life working at the library, volunteering at the local animal shelter, reading voraciously, learning to find peace in solitude. She followed Sarah's career from a distance, reading every article about her daughter's business success with pride she had no right to feel. She kept a photo of Emma, one she'd found online from a school fundraiser, on her nightstand. Watching her granddaughter grow up through occasional glimpses on the internet. Every year on Emma's birthday, Victoria pressed a wildflower from the Vermont mountains and sent it across the country. With no return address and no message beyond birthday wishes. It was the only contact she allowed herself, the only indulgence in a life otherwise devoted to invisible penance. She'd learned to find satisfaction in small things, helping a student find an obscure research book, comforting a lost cat until its owner could be found, reading stories to children at the weekly library program. A life of service rather than selfishness, of giving rather than taking. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of during those intoxicating months with Richard. It wasn't glamorous or passionate or exciting, but it was honest. And after a lifetime of performance and pretense, Victoria Sterling had finally learned to appreciate the radical authenticity of a life lived without lies. She would never be forgiven. She would never be welcomed back. She would never hold her granddaughter or earn her daughter's trust or undo the damage her selfish choices had caused. But she could live with integrity from this moment forward. She could protect them from a distance. She could love them without expectation or demand. And sometimes, late at night when the Vermont mountains were silent under starlight, Victoria Sterling would allow herself to hope that love offered without condition, protection given without recognition, and sacrifice made without acknowledgement might eventually add up to something resembling redemption. Not forgiveness. She'd long ago accepted that some sins are permanent. But perhaps, in time, a kind of peace that comes from finally learning the difference between taking what you want and giving what is needed. The forbidden attraction that had once promised everything had ultimately taught her the most valuable lesson of her life, that real love is measured not by what you're willing to do for someone, but by what you're willing to give up for them. Victoria Sterling had given up everything. And in return, she'd gained the only thing that had ever truly mattered: the knowledge that Emma Sterling Chen was safe, loved, and free to build a life unmarked by her grandmother's failures. It would have to be enough. For some people, it might not have been. But for Victoria Sterling, who had spent most of her life taking more than she gave, it was the most meaningful gift she'd ever offered. Even if the recipients would never know who had given it.